Hello, my name is Don Rule, and I consider it a great privilege to be able to come to you by means of this video and present to you a series of lessons which I believe are very vital on marriage and the family. And I would like to commend you for searching the scriptures to find God's solutions and God's plan for how life should be. Therefore, it is my desire that the grace and peace that come only from God and only through His Son, Jesus Christ, may be upon you richly, enhancing your marriage and your family, making it a great one indeed. In this series of lessons, I'm going to be using the American Standard Version of 1901. Also, notes for this course are available from the World Video Bible School, and I would encourage you to get those and use them in conjunction with this study. Let's begin now with our first study, the heartbeat of marriage. This text will be based upon Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 through 25. Now, my friends, as we look at this particular text, we're going to find that God could have created a mate for Adam when Adam himself was created. But for some reason, God did not do that. And the question is, why? Indeed, I believe that God wanted Adam to observe something. That when the mate was finally presented to him, he would see that they thus had a deep need for each other, and that there were similarities between the two of them. That their roles in marriage are like the roles in singing. They're complementary. Now you're going to notice as we go through Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 through 25, that the 6 points we will draw from this are in many ways synonyms. But they're all kind of looking at the same point from different angles, like taking a diamond and turning that diamond around and looking at all the different cuts of that diamond, further appreciating what has been done. Also in this text, in this lesson, in this whole series, I hope that you will recognize God as the creator of marriage and the family. And I hope that that will encourage you to follow His plan and His pattern for marriage. And by doing so, you will find your marriage to be a fulfilling one. Let's begin now by looking at the text. We're going to begin with verse 18 of Genesis chapter 2. Now let's observe what happened here after God created the man. And Jehovah God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a help meet for him." Here, God Himself, observing His own creation and looking at Adam, the first man, for some reason said something's not good here. He said it was not good for man to be alone. Thus, the first thing we learn here is man's need for compassion. The heartbeat of marriage is the idea of there being companionship within that marriage. And I think it's interesting that the first time during the creation week, this pronouncement was made after God created Adam, the man. Now certainly man is greater than the rest of God's creation. He's greater than the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and so forth. And when He made them, God said it was good. But then He creates man and says it is not good. Why would God say that? I am persuaded that as far as humans are concerned, companionship is intrinsic with man. Man needs a woman to support him, one who will understand him and help him through the trials of life without mocking him and tearing him down. Thus, God desired to bring a helpmeet to Adam. Now, the meaning of help meet is something very important for us to understand. In fact, in the margin of the ASV, the American Standard Version, it has a note on the word meet, telling us that it means answering to. In other words, he needed a help who would answer to him. Not simply meaning that whenever he had a request or wanted something done, that she would snap to it, but rather that he needed a helper who was comparable to him, who was compatible, who was a complement that fit with the man, able to meet his needs like how no other could do. Indeed, we know that that's what companionship is all about, is helping another person to improve. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 27, verse 17, the Bible shows us how companionship is intended by God to make a person better. There Solomon said, "Iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend." Well, likewise, we should be able to say that the wife sharpens the countenance of her husband, and the husband sharpens the countenance of his wife, for they are to be companions. In 1 Peter 3, verse 7, this same concept is given by the Bible, when Peter says that a husband and wife are joint heirs of the grace of life. So indeed, both the man and the woman must recognize the woman as being a help. She must be willing to render herself as a help for her husband. But at the same time, he's got to be willing to nurture her, train her, cherish her as his helper, so that she may be forever desirous of helping her husband. As we continue now in the narrative, in verses 19 and 20 of Genesis 2, let's observe the next thing that we find to be the heartbeat of marriage. Here it is written, "And out of the ground Jehovah God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens, and brought them unto the man to see what he would call them. And whatsoever the man called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And the man gave names to all cattle, and to the birds of the heavens, and to every beast of the field. But for man there was not found a help meet for him." In this part of the text, Moses, I believe, is showing us that men and women, husbands and wives, should be best friends. My friends, is it really true that a dog is man's best friend? You know, we often hear it said that dolphins are very close to man's intelligence. And yet if we met another human being that had the intelligence of a dolphin, we'd think there's something wrong. Or sometimes it is said that apes are closely related to mankind. And again, if we met someone who was like an ape, we would think there was something seriously wrong with that person. So really, there is not any animal on this earth that is a true companion to man. Only woman is a true friend as far as marriage is concerned. I am persuaded that Adam must have heard what was stated in verse 18 of our text, because here God was allowing Adam to observe for himself the insufficiency of the animals. He was seeing how it wasn't good for him to be alone, and animals just could not fulfill that need. So that when God eventually brought Eve to him, he would be able to appreciate this woman. And you'll also notice in the text that Adam gave appropriate names to all these animals, and yet nowhere will you read in that narration that he called any of them woman, because none of them yet were that help that was comparable to Adam. Continuing again in the text, in verses 21 and 22, we learn the third point about what is the heartbeat of marriage. Here it is written, And Jehovah God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which Jehovah God had taken from the man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. Here we're learning something that is so very vital, that woman was taken out of man. It is interesting that in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 8 and 12, the Apostle Paul made reference to the idea of men and women coming from each other. Paul wrote, "For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. For neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this cause ought the woman to have a sign of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman without the man, nor the man without the woman in the Lord." Here we're learning the idea of respect. Hopefully, Adam and Eve could see that very thing, as is recorded back there in Genesis 2. And the point is that hopefully we will see the very same thing also. There should be respect for one another. The man should respect the woman, for she was taken out of him. And she should respect him, for she is indeed a part of him. If she degrades him, she's only degrading herself. If she thinks that he is not worthy of her respect, then really she's only reflecting upon herself. And similarly, he should respect her, for again, she is a part of him. And so when he builds her up, it's not a disgraceful or shameful thing or embarrassing thing for a man to speak highly of his wife. Indeed, when he respects his wife, he's helping to build a very vital relationship with her. In Ephesians chapter 5, verses 28 and 29, Paul wrote this, "Even so, ought husbands also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He that loves his own wife loves himself. For no man ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, even as Christ also the church." Now, with respect for each other, they should be joyful in one another's presence. Have you ever found yourself, for example, avoiding people who disrespect you? Indeed, we all do that. If someone doesn't like us, we find ourselves backing away from those people. But if he recognizes that she has a deep part in him, that she is an extension of himself, then he will respect her. Did you notice back there in the text of Genesis 2 how that the Bible said she was made from his rib? God took this rib out of the side of a man and built a woman. N.B. Hardeman, a former president of Freed-Hardeman College, in his wedding ceremonies used to include a poem that he wrote that I would like to read to you at this present time, because I believe it describes what we're seeing here in Genesis chapter 2. Here's what N.B. Hardeman wrote. "When the Spirit of God brooded over the Garden of Eden, it was observed that the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field had each its respective mate, but that man, for whom all else was created, was left alone. Thus, as a hermit he sighed, until woman smiled upon him. Out of the dust of the earth man was created. He was akin to the hard rocks and the strong fibers of the trees, able to suffer and endure. When it was no longer good that he should be alone, woman, the sweetest, dearest, and best of all creation, was wrought into existence. She was not made from man's head to be his ruler, nor from his heel to be trampled under his foot, but from his side, that she might be loved and protected by him. She was then as pure as the lily unkissed by the morning sun, as beautiful as the full-blown rose, as modest as the daisy of the field or the drooping violet, as sweet as the pink, all covered with dew, as graceful as the fern, and as trusting as the clinging vine. Don't you find that to be a beautiful text describing what we're seeing here in Genesis chapter 2? I believe that Brother N.B. Hardeman caught the essence of what Moses was describing for us. Indeed, God could have created Eve like he did Adam. That is, take some dirt and make a woman. But he didn't do that. Instead, God took the time, if we could say that about God, to cause Adam to go into a deep sleep. He then opened up his side. And again, God further troubled himself, and I say that rather loosely, but he troubled himself to take a rib out of Adam and closed it back up. And then out of this rib, God created a new being, so that Adam was literally giving of himself for his new companion. Here, Adam was literally putting a part of himself within his wife. I'm sure you've found yourself talking about someone else, or maybe someone has said this about you, or you've just heard someone make the expression that I have trained that person in such a way, I've provided for them so that a part of me is in them. And of course, we don't mean that in a literal way, like how was the case with Adam and Eve. But we do mean that something about us is within that person. And in this case, in marriage, it should be the case that the husband has put his thinking, his aims, his goals, his values in life within the heart of his wife. And indeed, all those things should be scriptural things. He could certainly put worldly thinking within her, and definitely he must avoid that. But back there in Genesis 2, Moses said that God brought the woman unto the man. Doesn't that almost sound like how we do in our weddings today when the father presents the bride to the groom? Maybe we got that tradition from this part of the Bible. I really do not know. But since it is the case that God brought the woman unto the man, and since he continues to do that today, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 19, verse 6, something that we quote in our weddings frequently. Jesus said, "What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder." Also in the book of Proverbs, chapter 19 and verse 14, there's a very similar thought that all of us would do well to grab a hold of and let this guide our marriages. Here it is written, "Houses and riches are an inheritance from fathers, but a prudent wife is from Jehovah." In the chapter just before, chapter 18 of Proverbs, verse 22, again Solomon said, "Whoso finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor of Jehovah." Do you see what the Bible is saying, my friends? Because of the fact that woman was originally created out of man, and now the man comes from the woman, because God brings a man and a woman together in marriage, because it's God's favor, it's God's gift, we ought to be very careful to respect one another, realizing this important point. If we reject each other, we are ultimately rejecting God. In the New Testament, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 8, there's a principle upon which I'm working here when I say to reject one's mate is essentially to reject God. There Paul says, "Whosoever rejects not man, but God, who gives his Holy Spirit unto you." Now, have you ever had someone refuse a gift that you were trying to give to them out of the kindness of your heart? Were you offended when that happened? Well, I'm sure that God is offended when we turn away His gifts, and we never want to be found offending the great God of heaven. Now as we go further in the text, Genesis 2 and verse 23, we're going to find here another vital principle about the heartbeat of marriage. Here it is written, "And the man said, 'This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man.'" Unity. Unity is the thing that we want to see here. The woman is an equal human being with her husband. Perhaps this is why in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, Paul told us that in Christ there is no male and female. That's because they're equal. Yes, as far as our relations on earth and so forth, there are some differences. But as far as what makes a person, a human, they're equal. She is not a slave whose only concern is for her husband. Indeed, she has many, if not all, of the same needs as her husband. And he must be diligent to meet those needs in her. Now in Genesis 2:23, Adam recognized the similarities between himself and his new wife, his new companion. Remember that he had observed those animals and he saw something missing. Something wasn't right. I mean, he gave them names, but he never gave them a name that was related to his own name. But now, here comes his new wife. And he names her, showing that he recognized that this is what he needed. There was something similar between the two of them that he never saw in the animals. Perhaps you've gone shopping for your friend one time, your mate, and you didn't know what to get. You went through the stores and you saw this and you thought, no, that's not going to work. And you saw something else and that wasn't going to work either. You kept looking and you kept looking, and finally you found the right gift. It clicked. All of a sudden he says, that's it. That's what I've been looking for. And I'm sure that's what happened with Adam. He didn't know exactly what he needed. But when he saw the woman, he saw her there before his eyes, he realized, this is what I've been needing. I shall no longer be alone. I shall no longer have a void. But now, I'll have fulfillment. Going on into verse 24 now of Genesis 2, here's another vital principle that shows us the heartbeat of marriage. The fifth point is stated when Moses wrote this: "Therefore, shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." A man leaves his parents and begins to take on his own responsibility, becoming his own man. And of course, implied in all of this is the fact that the parents must be willing to let him go. They must recognize the fact that if indeed it is true, he's a man, that they must recognize that fact. That he is now a man. He is capable of running his own household. And they should be willing to let him do that. That doesn't mean that he has to forsake them and never have anything to do with them again. But he's his own man now. She is her own woman when she leaves her parents. And now they are starting a new family, a new life together. And so he cleaves to his wife, clinging to her like he never wants to lose her. And indeed, that's what he should be thinking within his very heart. Now, how is it that they cling to one another? Well, consider what we have just looked at since verse 18 of this second chapter of Genesis. The first thing that we saw was the need for companionship. Thus, the two of them must work on building their companionship. What was the second thing we saw? The fact that they're best friends. And they should recognize that and live their lives like they are indeed each other's best friends. Being respectful of one another. Indeed, it will be so much easier to cling to our mate, our spouse, if we have respect for the other person. Maintaining unity. That's why God created marriage, to bring two people, a man and a woman, together. He didn't want to separate them. He didn't want them to live alone. But rather, his desire was for unity. And then looking at the verse that we're currently looking at, verse 24, they've got to be willing to be determined to cleave to one another. For as I'm sure you know, there are a lot of things that come up in this old world that try and separate a husband and wife. Some things good and some things bad. But nevertheless, they try and separate. And when I say some things good, I mean like there's things we've got to do in life. We must work and we have things we've got to take care of. But if we're not careful, those things can drive us apart. And another thing that's involved in cleaving or clinging to one another is of not being ashamed. And we'll see that in a few moments when we get into the next verse. But it is also important that a husband and wife be careful to please one another. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 33 and 34, the Apostle Paul was addressing the issue of marriage and of remaining single and so forth. And I want you to notice very carefully what he says here. He's going to talk about the fact that a person who is single can devote all of their time and attention to the Lord, whereas a person who is married must divide their time. They give some to the Lord and some to their mate. Now, of course, in giving time to their mate, they're doing what God wants them to do. So, in that sense, they're giving time to the Lord. But Paul's not saying that this is something bad, but it's just something to consider before a couple decides to marry. And indeed, when they do marry, they must be careful to do what he said here. Listen carefully. But he that is married is careful for the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and is divided. So also the woman that is unmarried and the virgin is careful for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married is careful for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And see, again, Paul is saying that's good. Marriage, to run properly, the husband must think about, now how can I please my wife? The wife must think, how can I please my husband? For in doing so, they each become happy. Also, in order to make sure that we keep ourselves clung to one another, it is essential that we give each other a high priority. Of course, not above God himself, but above the other things of the world. Now, it would seem like this should be very natural for a husband and wife. For often before a husband and wife marry, when they're dating one another, they're very careful to make sure to please one another and to cleave to each other. Nothing's going to separate them. They do all they can to contact each other every day, either seeing each other, writing letters, or calling on the phone. I'm not sure what happens, but it seems like after that wedding day, things begin to happen to where maybe they figure, I've got her now, I've got him now. And soon their attention starts going into other things. And pretty soon they're living their own separate lives, though they are married. And certainly that is not healthy for a marriage. Also in Genesis 2:24, Moses said that they were to become one flesh. Now certainly children are a byproduct of their having become one in flesh. But in marriage, when these two people join together, they're becoming like one person, so that their goals, their joys, their heartaches, their money, their possessions, everything that was once separate is now one. They're together. They share these things because they are in truth one person. Not technically or legally speaking. They become one flesh, man and woman become one flesh when they're married on that wedding day. But in spirit, they become one flesh when they cleave to one another. Now, the reason I mention that is because there are a lot of married couples that, they are married, and they're not going to divorce because they believe it's wrong. God would forbid that. But at the same time, they're miserable. As though God said, I just want you to stay together. I don't care what state your marriage is in. Just as long as you're together, that's all I'm concerned about. That's not the case. Not only does God not want us to divorce, but He wants us to cleave to one another in the deepest love. Let's now look at the last part of Genesis chapter 2, verse 25. Here our sixth point is stated like this. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. Did you catch that? The Bible is telling us that the state of nakedness between a husband and wife is God created. It is man, however, who has perverted that state by displaying it publicly. And I would encourage you to read Genesis chapter 3, and there you will find that it was after the man and the woman sinned that they were thus ashamed of their condition. But at this point in verse 25, they were not ashamed to be with each other. For as they could very well see, each was the gift of God Himself. And my friends, we should be the same way. Not only should we not be ashamed of our husband or wife in private, but when we're with each other in public, we should never be ashamed of our spouse. And even when our spouse is not present with us, and maybe we're with our friends or our co-workers or neighbors or something like that, we should never put down our husband or wife, but rather have the respect for them that we spoke about earlier. Do not be ashamed of your husband or wife, for God has been looking down upon you and brought you two together. Interestingly, in Genesis 1, verse 31, we find something that is now different. Now earlier when I read to you from Genesis 2:18, I showed you how that when God created the man, He said it wasn't good. And remember that I pointed out to you there that God had never said that before. He created the earth, He made the light, He made the plants, the sea creatures, the animals upon the earth, and He said, that was good. Then He creates man, the one who is to have dominion over all these things because he is greater than the rest of creation. But yet when God created man, God said, it's not good. And I have sought to show you why it was not good for him. But then after God finally created the man and the woman, He said something different. Now it's important to understand that Genesis 2 is basically where Moses is going back into the creation week and explaining some of the details for us. So what we read in Genesis 2, especially verses 18 through 25, actually took place before what is recorded in Genesis 1, verse 31. Now let's read that text to see what it says. Genesis 1:31 says, and God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good. Again, we find an interesting comment here by Moses. Earlier we said, when God created man, it was the first time that He said it's not good. But after He creates the woman, and now the man and the woman are together, they have the companionship, they're best friends, all those other things we just addressed. Now, for the first time, God not only says that it's good, but it is very good to be in this circumstance. It is very good when He saw all of creation. And then when He gave man, woman, the crown of God's creation, And he said, "It is very good." Now, after verse 25 was written by Moses, he then goes into the account of Genesis chapter 3 of how the serpent beguiled Eve, and she sinned, and eventually Adam sinned as well. But my point is this. After Genesis 2:25, Moses was done, at least for the moment, in describing the heartbeat of marriage. And you know something, my friends? There were no provisions for divorce. As though it wasn't even on God's mind. As though it didn't even occur to him that he should make provisions for divorce. For indeed, he brought the two to be together until death itself were to separate the two. Now we know later, such as in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 19, that an exception was granted, but that's just exactly what it is, an exception. And we need to be very careful that we not make what is stated in Matthew 19 verse 9 about when fornication takes place or adultery, that we don't make that exception into the general rule. For so many times I find people looking, well, I think he or she did this, and boy, I've got my reason for divorce. Yes, there may be that justifiable time. But let's remember to go back to the beginning. As God originally created marriage. And let's find what his intention was for it. And let's get the heartbeat of a marriage within our own marriages, that we might have all the joy and fulfillment that we sincerely desire. Now, this first lesson is presented, the heartbeat of marriage, because I believe that Genesis 2, verses 18 through 25, is describing for us and explaining the beginning of marriage, why it was created. Thus, what we find in Genesis 2 should be the beginning of our philosophy of marriage. I found that for myself, when I studied this passage, I had a new appreciation for my own wife and the relationship that she and I have. And friends, my desire is that you will also experience the same appreciation for one another. Thank you.